Yep.
And then we can, yeah, go. Very nice.
Okay, let's try and share the screen. So can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Good. Okay, fine. Well, thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you. So yes, some current issues in the later stages of human evolution. And I'm Chris Stringer from the Natural History Museum in London. So it doesn't seem to want to advance, but let's keep trying it. Okay. So today, there's undoubtedly only one human species around, Homo sapiens, also known as modern humans. And although we come in many different sizes and shapes and colors, there's no doubt that we are one species. We're completely interfertile, and we share many features, morphological features, genetic features, and in the skeleton too. And we can see on the right-hand side there, a modern human skeleton from our exhibition in the Natural History Museum in London. And when we look at our skeleton, we can see that we've got a number of derived features compared with some of the other humans that I'll be talking about. So for example, in our skeleton, we've got a high narrow rib cage, indicating smaller lungs relatively, a narrow, less flared pelvis. We've got smaller joint surfaces on the bones. We've got a lighter build to the whole skeleton. And when we come to our head, to our skull, again, a number of distinctive features. We've got a globular brain case, high and rounded, particularly expanded in the upper parietal region. There's a weak brow ridge or no brow ridge at the front of the brain case. We've got distinctive ear bone shapes. We've got a narrow base to the skull. We've got a flat midface. We've got relatively small front teeth, and we've got a developed chin on the lower jaw. So these are all features which we can look for in fossils to try and map the evolution of Homo sapiens in the past. And when we go back in the past, there's a lot of diversity. So these bars here, different colored bars, represent different lineages of humans. Most of them I would regard as different species of humans that were around on the Earth in the last 1 million years. So when we come into the last few 100,000 years, you can see in the green there on the top left, we've got Homo sapiens, we've got the Neanderthals in yellow, people called the Denisovans in the middle of the diagram there. So I'm going to concentrate on these ones in particular in my talk. And even 70,000 years ago, which is like yesterday, geologically speaking, there were still at least 5 kinds of humans around on the Earth. So we, Homo sapiens, have been evolving in Africa. The Neanderthals have been evolving in Europe and Asia. Over in Eastern Asia, there are these people called the Denisovans. And down in Southeast Asia, on the islands of Southeast Asia, we had 2 dwarf species of human. On Flores in Indonesia, Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit for its small size. And in the Philippines, a species we've only learned about in the last couple of years, Homo luzonensis. So there was all that diversity even 70,000 years ago. So we're going to look at 4 things if there's time. One is the situation in Africa, our origins there and our dispersals from there. Going to look at data in Europe and Asia about the Neanderthals and our interactions with them. I'm going to look at the Denisovans in Eastern Asia. And finally, this big question, which we really can't yet answer satisfactorily, what happened to all those other kinds of humans? Why are we the only ones left? So first of all, let's look at Africa and our origins there. And so here's a very simple representation of the evolution of the Neanderthal and Homo sapiens lineages. So on the left there, we've got a representation of the Neanderthal lineage evolving over several 100,000 years. And that evolution took place in Europe and Asia. And we've got a late Neanderthal there from France, La Ferracie, and lower down, one from Spain, from the Cima de los Huesos, which is over 400,000 years old, and which seems to represent an early member of the Neanderthal lineage. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the representation of the evolution of Homo sapiens, which started, as far as we know, in Africa. So we've got a recent fossil Homo sapiens at the top there, about 30,000 years old, from France, from Cro-Magnon, and lower down one from Morocco, from Jebel Ihud, about 300,000 years old. So geneticists estimate that we had a common ancestor maybe 500,000 or 600,000 years ago between us and the Neanderthals. And who that ancestor was, where it lived, is uncertain. We don't know even the continent origin of our ancestor with the Neanderthals. It could have been Europe, it could have been Asia, it could have been Africa. And until recently, there was a view that the evolution of modern humans in Africa was a fairly straightforward, a linear, gradual process with gradual change over the last 500,000 years or so, from something more primitive, such as this species Homo heidelbergensis on the left, through intermediate forms to later Homo sapiens within the last 100,000 years. So a simple unilinear model, and often an assumption that it occurred in one region of Africa. Often East Africa was the favored area for the evolution of Homo sapiens. And in the last few years, we've had some nice fossils which may represent early members of the Homo sapiens lineage turning up from Morocco. In fact, this site of Jebel Ihud in Morocco has been known for more than 50 years, and fossils from it started to appear in the 1960s. But it's only recently that they've been studied in great detail, new finds have been made, and the site has been well dated. And we now know that this form of possibly ancestral Homo sapiens is about 300,000 years old. So there are beautiful stone tools associated with these fossils. We can see some on the right-hand side there. And on the bottom left, we've got a composite skull from Jebel Ihud. And it's got some modern human features in the teeth, in the shape of the face, for example. But the shape of the brain case is still long and low, and that's a primitive feature. It doesn't yet seem to have evolved the high and rounded brain case that we find in later Homo sapiens. But we find that brain case in a fossil that's over 200,000 years old, from Homo kibish in Ethiopia. So this has recently been redated, as it says here, by dating the proximal deposits of an eruption. We obtain a new minimum age for the Homo fossils of about 233,000 years. So this team of scientists, led by people in Cambridge, dated a volcanic layer overlying the Homo kibish skeleton and dated it to over 200,000 years. So this skeleton, as far as I'm concerned, is a Homo sapiens. It's a modern form of Homo sapiens. It's got a high and rounded brain case, got a chin on the lower jaw, relatively small brow ridge, and the skeleton also shows modern human features. But if we look at the pattern throughout Africa, from 300,000 years down to about 100,000 years, it's actually very difficult to make a clear, gradual pattern of change from a more primitive to a more modern appearance. The fossils show different mixtures of features, even from single sites. They show different mixtures of what we can call primitive and modern features. So it looks like there's a complex pattern of origin for Homo sapiens. And I've been part of a group who've developed the idea that the evolution of Homo sapiens wasn't occurring in just one region of Africa. This is a quote from Eleanor Sherry, who led one of our papers. Humans did not stem from a single ancestral population in one region of Africa, as is often claimed. Instead, our African ancestors were diverse in form and culture and scattered across the continent. So on the bottom right there, you can see a representation of this idea that this is a Pan-African origin, different lineages going through time in different areas, at times connecting with each other, at times going their separate ways, some of these lineages going extinct, and what we call modern humans coalescing, in a sense, from these different morphologies in the last 100,000 years or so. And it's even more complicated than that, because not only is there diversity when we look at the Homo sapiens fossils across Africa, but it seems that there were other species coexisting with us. And we have to remember that even now, our fossil record only comes from possibly 10% of the whole area of Africa. So there's a lot still to learn about the African pattern. So, for example, this fossil from Kabwe in Zambia, Broken Hill, it's often known as, I call this Homo heidelbergensis or Homo rhodesiensis, a distinct species of a primitive species. Some people, and I've for a number of years thought this too, see this as the ancient ancestor of Homo sapiens in Africa. But we now know this fossil is about 300,000 years old. So it's about the same age as that Moroccan fossil from Jebel Ihud that we talked about earlier, and yet it's much less like Homo sapiens. So as it says here in this paper from Nature from a couple of years ago, the age estimate raises further questions about the mode of evolution of Homo sapiens in Africa and whether Homo heidelbergensis or rhodesiensis was a direct ancestor of our species. So this pattern here is in question, and particularly the shape of the face seems to make it much less likely that this ancient species heidelbergensis or rhodesiensis is the ancestor for Homo sapiens. And we've got an additional species down in southern Africa, a much more primitive species, which again we've only learnt about in the last 8 years or so, Homo naledi, found in deep in a cave system near Johannesburg. As it says, Homo naledi's overall body plan, its shoulders, hips and torso hark back to much earlier ancestors, while its lower body shows more human-like adaptations. The skull and teeth show a mixture of traits. So this species has a very small brain, more or less an ape-sized brain, and yet it was still around in southern Africa about 300,000 years ago, and we don't know when it went extinct. So there we are. The pattern now seems to be that around 300,000 years ago, we had Homo sapiens evolving in parts of northern Africa. We had heidelbergensis or rhodesiensis in Zambia, and down in southern Africa, we had Homo naledi. So this diversity, which we really wouldn't have guessed 10 years ago. And of course, our DNA data comes in here. It's extremely important. And regressively, we don't have ancient DNA from the African continent, really ancient DNA. Obviously, with the warmer conditions in Africa, it's much less conducive to DNA preservation than in regions like Europe or parts of Asia. But what geneticists estimate is that looking at the diversity of humans today outside of Africa, that diversity derives from an expansion out of Africa, probably starting around 60,000 years ago. So this is from the paper I was a co-author with Anders Bergstrom and colleagues. And we argued that, as it said, the genetic ancestry outside of Africa is consistent with deriving from a major worldwide dispersal less than 60,000 years ago. But that dispersal was going to bring the Homo sapiens people coming out of Africa into the territories of the Neanderthals, who were already there in Europe and Asia. And it may be a bit more complicated even than that 60,000 dispersal. So there is evidence that there were earlier, if you like, attempts at colonizing Asia and Europe by Homo sapiens. One, for example, known from Greece, from Epidema, we've got what seems to be the back of a Homo sapiens skull, shown there on the top left there. This looks like the back of a high and rounded skull, so it looks like a Homo sapiens, and yet we can date it at more than 200,000 years old. So there may have been some earlier, you could call them failed dispersers of Homo sapiens out of Africa, which never established the species outside of Africa until later on. And similarly, signs of early Homo sapiens fossils in China and in Sumatra, and the presence of humans apparently in northern Australia more than 65,000 years ago. Now, they would have needed boats to get to Australia, and what we have in levels at this site of Madjabebi in northern Australia is a lot of use of pigments and complex technology, which we assume is the work of Homo sapiens, and yet this site is dated apparently at about 65,000 years ago. Not everyone agrees. Some people think the site has been wrongly dated and is probably only about 45,000 years ago, which would make it consistent with this 60,000 year dispersal of Homo sapiens. But if the pattern's correct that there was an early wave out of Africa more than 100,000 years ago, which eventually reached Australia, and there was a main wave about 60,000 years ago, which is the one that is represented in modern genetic diversity outside of Africa, we have to assume that that main wave which started after 60,000 years ago, overprinted and removed any trace of any earlier waves of Homo sapiens that still survived. Okay, so now let's look at the pattern in Europe and Asia and our interactions with the Neanderthals. And the Neanderthals are really the most famous ancient fossil people. They're called Neanderthals because the skeleton on the bottom left was found in the Neander Valley in Germany in 1856, Neander Valley, Neanderthal. And although the first finds were from Europe, we now know the Neanderthals extended across Asia. They're in Western Asia, they're in Uzbekistan, they're in Siberia. They may even have been in China at times. And they've undergone a tremendous change in image in the last 20 years, I would say, in particular. So at the top right there, we can see a representation of the Neanderthals from 1909. And at that time, there were none of the early primitive fossils that we know about from Africa. And so the Neanderthals were pushed into this position of being a sort of missing link in human evolution, depicted here as being very ape-like, hairy, bent knees, grasping big toes, and so on. Clearly, that's wrong. The Neanderthals were fully human. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger than the modern average. They walked upright as well as we do. And a representation from today, from the recent period, is shown there on the bottom right. This is a Neanderthal as shown in our Human Evolution exhibition in London, done by the Kennis brothers, a very human representation of a Neanderthal there. But nevertheless, the Neanderthals are distinct from us. Although they're fully human, I think they represent a different kind of human. I argue a different species of human. So we mentioned the shape of the rib cage and the pelvis. Well, the Neanderthals have a much bigger rib cage, much broader, much deeper. They've got much wider pelvis. So their internal organs probably were larger than ours. Their lungs may have been 20% larger than ours. They have a more robust skeleton overall. And the differences even extend into the skull. And you can see here some of the distinctive Neanderthal features. Some of these are primitive features, the longer lower skull, the strong brow ridge they inherited from their ancestors, and the weak chin development. But they have distinctive features which mark off the Neanderthal lineage, such as the projecting middle of the face, distinct shapes of the inner ear bones, and a little depression in the back of the skull called the superiliac fossa. So those, again, are features we can look for in fossils to map the evolution of the Neanderthal lineage. So modern humans then evolved in Africa, came out of Africa on this main dispersal about 60,000 years ago. And we can see on the top right there some signs of intermixture between the Neanderthals and us, which we can map through DNA. So that expansion coming out of Africa, these are all early sapiens fossils for which we've got genomic data. So this brings us on to that question of interbreeding, and we've been arguing about it for a long time. The fossil on the bottom right there from Portugal was argued to be a hybrid of a Neanderthal and a modern human. In fact, it's only about 26,000 years old, and now it looks very unlikely to be any kind of hybrid. Unfortunately, we don't have its DNA to test the view that it's got an unusual amount of Neanderthal DNA in it. And I was aware that, of course, closely related mammal species can often hybridize. We've got an example on the top left there. The brown bear and polar bear can hybridize and have fertile offspring. Jackals and wolves can do that. Many species of baboon can do that. So I was aware Neanderthals and Homo sapiens could have hybridized potentially, but until recently, I thought it was unlikely that it happened. I didn't think it would be normal behavior, and it happened maybe 40 or 50,000 years ago, so we wouldn't find evidence of it today in modern human genomes. And I was wrong about that. And this paper in Science from 2010 began to show that. So as it says here, close encounters of the prehistoric kind. The long-awaited sequence of the Neanderthal genome suggests that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred tens of thousands of years ago, perhaps in the Middle East. In fact, we now say more widely than that, in Europe as well. As a result, most people, I would say, pretty well everyone living outside of Africa has inherited a small but significant amount of DNA from these extinct humans. So I've had my genome tested, and yes, I, like most people in Europe and Asia and Australia and the Americas, have about 2% Neanderthal DNA in my genome. So here are some of the sites which recently have been featuring in studies of the interactions of the last Neanderthals and the modern humans who came into Europe after about 50,000 years ago. And here's one example, this jawbone from Oasi in Romania. It's about 40,000 years old. And it's got a nice chin on the front, so it looks like a Homo sapiens, but the teeth have some unusual features. And so it was thought that it might have mixed ancestry. Well, sure enough, the genome of this human from Romania has been tested. And as it says here, this individual has, about close to 10% of Neanderthal DNA in the genome. And so it looks like this individual's Neanderthal ancestor was introduced in the previous 4 to 6 generations. So evidence here, even near the end of their time, we think the Neanderthals went physically extinct around 40,000 years ago. And yet this individual shows signs of Neanderthal interbreeding within the previous few generations. And if you want more on this, there's a nice review paper by Liu and colleagues. This is a diagram from it. It's quite a complicated diagram, a lot in this, but you can see there on the left, the divergence. I'm going to have to turn my phone off. Yes, so we can see on the left there, the divergence of the Neanderthal and Denisovan lineage. And we can see there in the center, on the right-hand side, we can see African recent human genomes diverging off. And in the center there, we've got the genomes of populations in Asia and Europe, Homo sapiens genomes. Some of them seem to be dead ends. They don't contribute to present-day populations, and others are diverging through and giving rise to populations today in East Asia, in Europe, and Siberia. And that Neanderthal DNA, having got into our genomes, mainly in the period, it seems, between about 40 and 55,000 years ago, it could have been as high as 10% in some of these populations, but selection then removes that Neanderthal DNA pretty quickly. So as we map the levels of DNA in early Homo sapiens populations in Europe and Asia, we can see that the Neanderthal DNA is declining. So you can see on the left-hand side, the Oasi individual, the DNA is at the level of about 9 or 10%, but other Homo sapiens fossils have lower levels, 4 to 5%, and then it declines through to the levels of about 2% that we find today. So this brings up the tricky question of species, and are the Neanderthals really a distinct species? Well, I would say morphologically they are, even though there's interbreeding. So this is a piece I wrote on the Natural History Museum website. And as I say down here, in my view, if Neanderthals and Homo sapiens remain separate long enough to evolve such distinctive skull shapes, pelvises and ear bones, they can be regarded as different species, interbreeding or not. Humans are great classifiers, and we do like to keep things orderly, but we should not be surprised when the natural world, past and present, does not match up to our neat and simple schemes. And some of that Neanderthal DNA in the genomes today is still active. So here's a paper, one of many actually, which tries to map the activity of some of that DNA. And you can see here at the bottom there, the suggestion that type 1 balding, menopause age, susceptibility to sunburn, lung capacity, bone density, whether you're a morning or an evening person, your white blood cell count. There are bits of Neanderthal DNA which can be correlated with slight differences between different members of modern humans. So some of this DNA does seem to be active today in our genomes. So let's move on now to the Denisovans, people who we now know live in East Asia for a long period of time. So we only learnt about these people in the last 10 years or so. Russian archaeologists have been digging a cave called Denisova Cave in southern Siberia, in the Altai region, for about 50 years. And they'd found some fragmentary human fossils. They were too fragmentary to say what kind of human they were. But remarkably, these fossils have fantastic DNA preservation. And so the whole genome of an individual was recovered from a tiny fingerbone fossil, and the preservation of this fingerbone fossil was comparable to the quality of genome you could get from a modern human bone. So fantastic preservation, and this revealed a kind of human that was not Neanderthal, not modern human, but a separate kind of human that became known as the Denisovans. And mapping their occupation of Denisova Cave, we can see on the bottom right there a section of one of the chambers of Denisova Cave, and it's mapping the presence of Denisovans in parts of the cave layers from about 45,000 years down to over 150,000 years ago. And Neanderthals were also there at some of the same times. And they overlapped. And there's even what's thought to be a first generation hybrid between a Neanderthal and a Denisovan. This girl has been nicknamed Denny. So here are some of the remains from Denisova Cave. And in fact, these are the best preserved, most complete remains. As you can see, they're very fragmentary. The ones at the top have Denisovan genomes in them. And there's even part of a skull now of a Denisovan, Denisovan 13. And the ones at the bottom have Neanderthal genomes. So very fragmentary material, but remarkable DNA preservation in them. And this individual, Denny, Denisova 11, as I say, it's a girl who had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. So phenomenal data from this site of Denisova Cave. And not only that, it's not just the fossils that are producing DNA now, because work in the last couple of years has shown that even the sediments in the cave contain DNA not only of the animals that were living in the cave, but also the humans. So here's an example of nuclear and mitochondrial DNA recovered from cave sediments of Neanderthals in sites in Asia and Europe, and it's been applied to Denisova Cave with remarkable results. So we can see here a mapping of the sections of the sediments in Denisova Cave. So over 700 sediment samples have been obtained from this cave. 94% of them contain mammalian ancient DNA, and remarkably 24%, pretty well a quarter of them, contain traces of hominin aDNA. So these humans, bits of DNA, may represent bones that have disintegrated. They may represent even an individual that relieved themselves in the cave, a woman that gave birth in the cave. All of these could have led to the traces and survival of DNA in these cave sediments. So this is remarkable data which will revolutionize our view of human evolution going forward, where there is DNA preservation in cave sediments. We don't even need the fossils anymore to map the presence of ancient humans. And moving beyond the genome itself, there's also work going on proteomics, the preservation of fossil proteins, and these seem to have a better survivability often than the DNA. And so the study of fossil proteins is going to be big in the future also of human evolution. And one example has already been published, which shows how important this could be. This jawbone was found in a cave in the Tibetan plateau of China, from a site called Baishia Cave, and that cave has Denisovan DNA in its cave sediments, and it's also apparently produced this jawbone. I say apparently because the jawbone was actually in the possession of monks in this region, so it wasn't excavated systematically, but it's reported as coming from Baishia Cave. So this is a very robust jawbone. There's no chin on the front. It's got very large molar teeth. So in its robusticity and its big teeth, it already looked like it resembled the Denisovans, who have very big molar teeth. And a bit of proteomic material has been recovered, a bit of fossil protein material, and that maps on more closely to the Denisovan genetic sequence than the sequence of Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. So this is probably a Denisovan jawbone from the Tibetan plateau of China, and it's over 150,000 years old. And there are other fossils in China that might be Denisovans. There's one from India as well, from Narmada. There's a number from China that could be Denisovans. And this also includes this wonderful skull, which I was involved in studying earlier this year, or earlier last year now. So the so-called Dragon Man from Harbin in northeastern China. So this is beautifully preserved fossil. And one of the big questions is, could this be a Denisovan? And that's something we can't answer at the moment. We don't have DNA or proteomics from this fossil, but that's something we're looking at for the future to try and recover either DNA or proteomic material from this wonderful fossil. But it's dated again at over 150,000 years. So we don't know whether there will be a good organic preservation. And we also know that the Denisovans probably extended a long way south of Siberia, because remarkably, once the genomes of Denisovans have been mapped, it was found that populations, particularly in Ireland, Southeast Asia, and Australasia, had traces of Denisovan DNA in their genomes. And it's as high as 4% in some of the genomes in populations in Australasia and the Philippines. Now, it's not thought the ancestors of these people in Australasia ever went anywhere near Siberia. So the assumption is that the modern human dispersal about 60,000 years ago went through Western Asia, and there was interbreeding with Neanderthals there. Then populations moved through Southern Asia and moved down through Southeast Asia. And it seems to be down there that they mix with Denisovan-like people, probably in the last 50,000 years or so. So populations in Australia and New Guinea, for example, have both Neanderthal DNA from a slightly earlier phase of interbreeding, and then added onto it Denisovan DNA. So these Denisovans not only were up in Siberia, but apparently they were down in Southeast Asia too. And where exactly they were, we don't know, because we don't have any fossils that we can say are Denisovans from this region. We know that Homo floresiensis was living on Flores, and that doesn't look anything like a Denisovan. We know Homo luzonensis was up in the Philippines. That doesn't look anything like a Denisovan. We've got the much more primitive species Homo erectus still around on the island of Java. So some of us guess that these southern Denisovans were probably living in regions like Sumatra and Borneo and Sulawesi. And indeed, there are stone tools on Sulawesi, for example, that are more than 150,000 years old. And perhaps they were made by some of these southern Denisovans. So the Neanderthals had a range which we know ranges east-west across Asia. The Denisovans, by contrast, probably had a much wider distribution north-south, from the very cold areas up in Siberia and northeast China down to regions like in Sumatra and Borneo and Sulawesi. So finally then, this big question of why we're the only humans on Earth, what happened to the other people who were still around 70,000 years ago? So here we've got that representation again of these humans that were around about 70,000 years ago. As far as we know, by 30,000 years ago, all of these others had disappeared physically. Although, of course, in the case of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, bits of their DNA lives on in us today. And here are some of the ideas of what happened to those other humans. So various ideas, and I've got these from the popular literature. So on the top left there, Homo sapiens were to blame for Neanderthal extinction because they were better hunters and outcompeted them for food, a computer model shows. Bottom left there, climate change likely iced the Neanderthals out of existence. I mean, the problem with that is if it was climate change that was hitting the last Neanderthals, it also would have been hitting the Homo sapiens who were living alongside them. Top right there, one of the recent ideas, end of the Neanderthals linked to a flip of the Earth's magnetic poles, a study suggests. Event 42,000 years ago, combined with a fall in solar activity, was potentially cataclysmic, researchers say. This was a significant event in terms of solar activity and a change of the Earth's magnetic pole positions, but I don't think it could be linked with the disappearance of the Neanderthals. And again, it would have affected everything on Earth, not just the last Neanderthals. On the bottom right there, Homo sapiens developed a new ecological niche that separated it from other hominins. A new study argues that the greatest defining feature of our species is not symbolism or dramatic cognitive change, but rather its unique ecological position as a global generalist specialist. So we're able to spread widely, and then through our culture and behavior, we're able to specialize without having evolutionary adaptations. Our culture enables us to become a specialist in different environments such as deserts and rainforests. And in the center there, quite a nice idea, humans owe our evolutionary success to friendship. Cooperation was the key to our long-term survival. We cooperated more, we had less aggression within groups than maybe these other humans, such as the Neanderthals had. So I think overall, I think our behavior was probably the main factor in our success. Maybe we networked and accumulated knowledge better. We learned to extract resources more intensively from the environment than other humans did. And above all, we found ways of improving the survival of our children and the old. As our numbers grew and we spread ever wider, perhaps we absorbed some of the other species out of existence. So I'll stop there, and I hope we've got a bit of time for questions, and I will try and answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. It was really nice to hear about the more recent research in the field.
Yes.
So we do have some questions, and I guess I'll just read them out if anyone wants to ask.
Yeah, let's try some.
Question as well. Go ahead. So first one is, I was wondering how it is that people in the American continent evolved to have similar features and gene constitution of people coming from Eurasia and Africa.
Right, yeah. Well, we think that the populations of the Americas came over from Eastern Asia. So at times of low sea level, the sea level at times dropped by over 100 meters globally. So as the ice caps grew, as they often did in the ice ages, water was sucked up, if you like, from the oceans. Fresh water was taken out of the oceans into these huge ice caps that built up. So the sea level fell, and there was a land connection between Eastern Asia and Alaska. And it's thought that populations traveled across that land bridge. Some of them may have even hopped across the islands to the south of that land bridge. And this happened on present dating at least 20,000 years ago. So the populations in the Americas today genetically and physically relate to populations that were formerly in Eastern Asia. I don't know if that's enough to answer your question. Obviously, once they were in the Americas, they've had 10 or 15,000 years of evolution within the Americas, with the movement of some populations as well, such as the Inuit. They came across in a later wave from Asia.
What gaps in Homo sapiens evolution and dispersion do you think have the most potential to affect academia, i.e. anything that would alter our understanding of geographic or cultural changes?
Anything that would affect our, should you say that last bit again?
Our understanding of geographic or cultural changes. Right,
yes. Well, obviously, we have a very poor understanding of the genetics that affect cognition, for example. So obviously everyone wants to know whether Neanderthals could think like us. And that's been a huge debate for many years. So 20 years ago, I and many of us would have argued that the Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to Homo sapiens. When you looked at their culture, what they produced, it seemed to lack diversity. It seemed to lack the working of certain materials, such as ivory and bone and antler, which were all around but seemed to be hardly worked by the Neanderthals. It seemed to lack symbolic expression. Whereas with modern humans, we find these fantastic cave paintings in France and Spain and now Borneo and Sumatra. The Neanderthals were thought not to be doing that, and so on. And some people argued that Neanderthals lacked even complex language, and this held them back. We now know that the gap has closed. So we've found a lot more data about Neanderthals. We know that they behaved in more complex ways. They were producing symbolic objects. They were producing jewelry, for example, made of animal teeth. They were marking bones with geometric patterns. They were marking the floor of a cave in Gibraltar as what's called a hashtag, which seems to have been put there by Neanderthals more than 40,000 years ago. There's even evidence that they were marking cave walls. So the Neanderthals were behaving in more complex ways. They were working bone and antler and ivory, a bit less than we do. I think there's still a gap that the Neanderthals were not producing representational art. I don't think there's any good evidence of a statuette or a painting of an animal done by Neanderthals. So there are some gaps, but I think Neanderthals probably had language. So yes, I think if we can find ways to get to Neanderthal cognition, and some people are growing bits of brain tissue and they're sort of altering its genetic content to mimic the DNA of a Neanderthal. So we can start to see how Neanderthal brains were growing compared with ours and compared with chimpanzees. So I think that will be an interesting way forward. And I think we have a lot to learn about Neanderthal diversity. At the end of their time, they seem to have been very low in numbers and diversity. Even doing inbreeding, we've got evidence of very closely related individuals that are apparently breeding with each other. So the Neanderthals potentially were a threatened species even before Homo sapiens appeared alongside them. But we know very little about earlier Neanderthal diversity. And I think that's one of the things that cave sediments will help us with, to really map Neanderthal diversity across their whole range.
If you only recover partial fossils, example, the back of the skull, what methods might you use to infer the rest of the fossil in order to draw conclusions? Does computational modeling or prediction play a large role in this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's one of the things about the epidermal fossil. It is only the back of the skull, but it matches very closely another early Homo sapiens fossil from Israel that's a bit younger in age. But you're right. And what we know is from the African pattern is that a skull can look modern in one part of the skull, and it can be much more primitive in another part. So we do have to be cautious about that epidermal individual. But I didn't get a chance to mention that there is interesting evidence of an earlier genetic interchange between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So it looks like when you look at the genome, Neanderthal modern human divergence is estimated to be, as I mentioned, maybe 500,000 or 600,000 years ago. But when you look at the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, the divergence seems to be much younger, maybe only half the age. So there's a suggestion that there was an earlier exchange of DNA from Homo sapiens into Neanderthals, which replaced their original mitochondria and Y chromosomes with a pattern derived from Homo sapiens in Africa, maybe about 300,000 years ago. So that epidermal fossil could represent a Homo sapiens individual that might have been part of this population interbreeding with the Neanderthals at that time. But I agree, it's incomplete, and it's much better to obviously work with more complete fossils for a more reliable picture, if you like. Yeah.
We have quite a few more questions. That's all right. Due to modern world internationalism, i.e. different populations from across the world interbreeding, would you say humans will have a lot less diversity in several 100,000 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's argued that a lot of diversity, I mean, some of the populations who have been distinct for a long period of time, for example, island populations, are now mixing, of course, with wider gene pools. So their individual diversity, which has evolved over maybe thousands of years, in a sense is being diluted and perhaps lost. And the same thing's going on with language diversity, of course. The number of languages in the world is shrinking as many populations disappear or dwindle or take up the language of a much larger body of people. So yeah, that diversity, you could see it as perhaps decreasing. And I think in predicting the future, it is very difficult. I'm often asked, what's evolution going to produce in the future? And the fact is, of course, evolution doesn't have a forward look. It's about what works now. So I think it's very difficult to look forward. And I think something like climate change is going to be a much more significant factor in the diversity in maybe even 10,000 years. It will depend who gets through this period of severe climate change that we're going to be faced with in the immediate future.
How well preserved are the DNA from these ancient humans? Does DNA degradation influence our discussions around breeding between our species and Neanderthals?
Yeah, so yes, I mean, the first DNA recovery was 1997, tiny bit of mitochondrial DNA, and now we've got whole genomes, some of them to very high quality. So I mentioned the Denisovan genome, from that tiny finger bone. Svante Pääbo at the time, he said he was astonished because it was as good as genome recovery that he could get from a recent human bone, even though that bone is probably close to 100,000 years old. So we think Denisova cave, because of that cold environment, has been excellent for DNA preservation. And we've now got composite Neanderthal genomes that have very good coverage. So the number of genomes is going up and the number of early Homo sapiens genomes is going up. But of course, we lack genomes from some of the other parts of the world, the warmer parts of the world, and that's probably always going to be a problem. And maybe proteomics will come in and help us in some of those areas. But I think the evidence of the interbreeding is very strong. There are still just a minority of people who still challenge that there was interbreeding and that geneticists have misinterpreted the data, but it does seem to be well founded. And the interbreeding, as you've mentioned, the evidence is that, for example, our immune systems outside of Africa owe quite a lot, it seems, to the immune systems of Neanderthals. The HLA system, for example, seems to be closely linked with Neanderthal HLA systems. So it's very likely that we evolved in Africa. We had no natural immunity to the diseases outside of Africa. The Neanderthals had evolved those defenses, having lived outside of Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. So by interbreeding with the Neanderthals, we got a quick fix to our immune system and picked up some of their immune defenses. That was good news then. The downside is today, there also seems to be a link between the presence of Neanderthal DNA and certain autoimmune diseases. So it may be that in some people, that Neanderthal DNA has, in a sense, oversensitized their immune systems. So things like Crohn's disease and biliary cirrhosis seem to be linked with the presence of bits of Neanderthal DNA.
What techniques are used to date fossils and why do they lead to large discrepancies in the age? That was my question. I meant specifically, there was one fossil which you mentioned, which was dated to 65,000 years ago, I think. And I think you said that some groups thought it was from 45,000 years ago.
Yeah, so why So, yes, I mean, that's a whole talk in itself, the dating method. So the one that most people know about is radiocarbon dating. So radiocarbon is produced in the atmosphere all the time, and we take it up in our bodies naturally. When we die, we stop accumulating radiocarbon, and the radiocarbon we've got disappears. About half of it disappears about every just over 5,000 years. The amount of radiocarbon we got halves. So if you have an ancient bone, if you can measure the amount of radiocarbon in it, you can work out how long it's been, how long since that individual died by the amount of radiocarbon left. And the problem is, because it halves about every 5,000 years. So by the time you're back at 40,000 years, there's only a tiny bit of radiocarbon left to measure. And so that's where errors can come in. We have other methods of dating. So luminescence dating can be used on sediments, mapping really how long it is since that sediment was exposed to sunlight. And that was the method that was used for that Australian site, where I said that it had been dated to about 65,000 years, one level at the site. Other people actually cite radiocarbon dates that suggest it's younger. So there is dispute there. In the case of the fossils from China and Epidima, where you've got dating at least 150,000 years, there you're using a method called uranium series dating. So uranium isotopes decay through time, and you can use that decay, a bit like radiocarbon dating, to measure how long it is that sediment or that fossil has been in the ground. And I mentioned on Kibish, volcanic rocks can be dated very accurately by potassium argon dating and argon-argon dating. This method has been used to date rocks on the moon, and it can be used on Earth from 4,000 million years ago down to the recent past. So when you've got volcanic rocks, you can actually measure very accurately the decay that's gone on in those rocks since they solidified or since an eruption happened.
Thank you. Are there genes that define whether we are morning or evening people?
Well, there are, and I'm not an expert on this, but yes, there are apparently. And of course, these are genome-wide association studies, so you've got to be a bit careful. Obviously, you look for the prevalence of certain conditions, let's say depression or schizophrenia, and then you look for bits of DNA whose presence seems to correlate with people having that particular condition. And often it's only maybe a 1 or 2% extra probability of having that condition. And when you do that, yes, there are some genes which seem to map with personality traits, such as being a morning or an evening person. And as that diagram suggested, and you can obviously refer back to that paper, there are some bits of Neanderthal DNA that seem to actually favor someone being a morning person, and other bits that favor them being an evening person.
How is behavior and the accumulation of knowledge influenced by genes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's obviously not a direct link. So this is mainly cultural transmission. And so there are some people who've modeled the retention and growth of knowledge in human populations. And the idea is that if you're going to store knowledge, you need a certain core number of people to accumulate and hold that knowledge. So small groups that are threatened with extinction, or some individuals in that group are threatened with risky activities, let's say hunting behavior. Those individuals, if they store important knowledge, if they die, that knowledge has gone from the group. So the idea is that larger groups and more network groups are more likely to hold and build up knowledge. And so that seems to be a process that was important for us, that our groups potentially were larger than the Neanderthals. They were networking more widely across the landscape. And so we were able to accumulate and build our knowledge better. So that's not a genetic process. It's a process of cultural exchange and cultural evolution through time.
We have a couple of questions from Ethan. You wanted to ask them yourself?
Hi, Chris. Great talk. I'd just like to ask you 3 questions. So I was wondering why migrations occurred in waves instead of like a gradual, continuous diffusion of people out of Africa.
Yeah, I think that in some cases there have been waves, and we can see that when we map, let's say, the last 10,000 years in Britain, we have had, if you like, waves of movements of populations into Britain, with farming, with the second phase of farming, with the arrival of metalworking and so on. So there certainly have been ways when you can map it in that great fine detail. And of course, for the Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, we don't have that kind of resolution. And I think what we see even in Europe now is between 40 and 50,000 years ago, and there's even more evidence coming out next month. What we do see is that there were waves of Homo sapiens coming into Europe. It wasn't just one wave. So we used to think it was one wave at 40,000. We now can see that there was a wave probably more than 50,000 years ago that ultimately disappeared, it seems. Then another wave about 45,000 years ago. That too seems to have pretty well largely disappeared. And then a wave at around 40,000, which is the one that really started to form the basis of the populations that we find in Europe later on. So I think you're right that this idea of a single wave of a small group of people in some cases is wrong. On islands, it may be more accurate. There are some islands which have been populated by just really one ancestral group of people. But when we have more data, we sometimes find there was an earlier group that was supplanted. So yeah, it's a more complex story. So I hope that at least partly answers that question. What's your second one?
Oh, and my next question is, so you maintain that Neanderthals are a different species of Homo than humans, but so one of the earliest definitions of a species that I've studied in school, at least, is that a different species cannot interbreed and have fertile offspring. So how do you account for that?
That's a very good question. Yeah. So I was taught at school the biological species concept. Species are reproductively isolated, and that is one species definition. It can be useful, but I think it's one. I wrote a review paper recently. There are at least 35 different species definitions. The biological species concept is one of them, but the more we learn about the genomes of mammals and birds today, for example, the more we realize the biological species concept doesn't apply in many cases. On one estimate, 20% of closely related bird species hybridize. Most baboon species hybridize. Now you can say, well, they're not different species, but then you're extending the morphology beyond any reasonable level for a biologist to say what is a species. So yeah, it's a judgment. Species concepts are humanly created, as I said in my comment there. Nature doesn't recognize these simple concepts that we create. So yeah, there are people who say Neanderthals and us are both Homo sapiens, and I can see why they say that. I disagree with it, because if you believe that, then you're multiplying the diversity of Homo sapiens by 2 or 3 times compared with diversity today. So, for example, there are no living humans that have a pelvis like a Neanderthal. There are no living humans, as far as we know, that have inner ear bones or middle ear bones that are shaped like a Neanderthal. So you're going to immediately extend the diversity of Homo sapiens well beyond what we find today, and what we find in a group of fossils that we know from DNA are closely related to us.
Yeah.
And the third question, yeah.
Yeah, well, I was amazed at how many definitions of a biological species there are.
Yeah,
35.
There's
Wow.
a good literature on this if you Google it. Yeah.
But yeah, moving on. So my last question. So I've read the book by Robin Dunbar on human evolution, the Pelican Brief Introduction, and he seems to use a lot of for sociality. I wonder how contentious that is for measuring sociality of later hominids.
Yeah, that is very controversial. There are some people who've really attacked it recently. So, the idea of Dunbar's number, it's become famous that he argued that, the brain obviously is mapping social groups and social connections. And our brain, in his view, our brain allowed us to map a larger number of relatives in our social group than, say, Neanderthals. And as you go back in time, the group sizes of these earlier humans would have been smaller and smaller. And as I've said, that would have implications, for example, for the amount of cultural knowledge they can store. So yeah, Dunbar makes a point about that. And I was on a paper with him that argued that, and I don't know whether I believe it myself now, it's been attacked by a number of people, but what he and his colleague Eleanor Pierce argued was that Neanderthals had bigger orbits. This meant that their visual systems were larger automatically, and this meant that the visual centers in their brains must have been larger. And by implication, since the brain is a finite size, a larger occipital cortex and visual system automatically means smaller parts for the rest of the brain. So, yes, I think Robin's really an interesting, stimulating guy. You should get him along to give a talk next. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And a really good talk. That was really interesting.
Yeah.
We still have a couple of more questions. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, let's try a couple more. Yeah.
Okay. What are the modern anthropological implications of the interbreeding of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals? Why is it important to, or why are we interested in examining this?
Right, yes. So, well, the interbreeding is medically important, certainly. So there are people looking now at what this DNA is doing in our bodies. So there have been papers written that argue that some population susceptibilities to COVID are related to the presence of bits of Neanderthal DNA, and equally protection from COVID is related to particular bits of Neanderthal DNA. So it may help to explain differences around the world. For example, African populations have a much lower level of Neanderthal DNA. So it's important, it can be important medically. And of course, we've already gone over this species question. The connection between us and Neanderthals was a real physical connection, and with Denisovans too. So there was interbreeding. And there's interest in how this interbreeding happened, because if it happened through peaceful partner exchange, for example, then these groups, which I would call different species, were recognizing each other as similar. They're exchanging partners in a peaceful way. Now, the other extreme, there's a view that what happened was, as happens in some hunter-gatherer groups and in some chimpanzee groups, is that there were bands of modern human males and they ran out of partners, And so they went and raided a Neanderthal group and stole their females and forcibly incorporated them into their groups. Now, that's a very different picture of how the interbreeding happened. So, you know, people are interested in this, and geneticists tell me that as we build up data, it will be possible, at least in the future, to map how the Neanderthal DNA arrived in modern human populations. Was it mainly through males? Was it mainly through females? Or was it through maybe equal numbers, which might suggest more of an exchange of partners? So I think it's an interesting topic, and it certainly does have medical importance. Anatomically, yes, people are arguing that there are even bits of our anatomy, even bits of our brain, which do map onto differences of DNA between Neanderthals and modern humans. Yeah.
And the last question, how would scientists measure how far back a tool dates? Because the raw materials to form the tools will clearly be older than the tool.
Right, yes. Yeah, that's a good point. So, of course, if you were dating a tool made out of lava, if you date the lava, you're dating when that eruption happened and not when the human actually knocked off the flakes from it to make a tool. So, yeah, we can date those tools, generally speaking, only by their associated material. So a tool is lying in a particular layer. You can date that layer by a bone, which you date, let's say, with radiocarbon, or there's a layer of stalagmite, which you can date by uranium series, or you can date the sediments themselves using luminescence dating. So these methods, you know, can be applied in sites. So the tools themselves are difficult to date directly. Yes, you date them by association, and of course that's true for most fossils as well. We can directly date fossils by radiocarbon, but that only goes back maybe 40 or 50,000 years if we're lucky. You can date them by uranium series dating if they're covered in a crust, for example. But in many cases, the fossils are only dated by the sediments they're in. Of course, if you have the DNA, that also can be used to calibrate the age of the fossil. For example, mitochondrial DNA, through something called branch shortening, you can actually estimate the age of a fossil independent of any other data.
Well, okay, I'll stop the recording.